What you are about to hear is a story so disturbing it will make you question the smiling faces of those you meet every day. A tale of the darkness that can hide behind the most ordinary of facades. Before we pull back the curtain on this chilling narrative, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more stories that will have you looking over your shoulder. You're not going to want to miss what comes next. The bell above the door of the Plume and Platter chimed a cheerful, almost mocking welcome. Detective Inspector Miles Corrigan flinched, the sound a discordant note in the symphony of sirens that had become the morning soundtrack. The smell hit him first, a cloying sweetness, a coppery tang laced with the sharp, sour scent of decay. It was a smell he knew intimately, the perfume of death, but this was different. It was layered, ancient. His partner, Detective Sergeant Alistair Finch, a man whose stoicism was the stuff of legend within the force, had gone a shade paler. "Good Lord, Miles," he whispered, his breath fogging in the unusually frigid October air. "It's like a butcher's shop and a cemetery had a baby." "A very, very big baby," Miles murmured back, his eyes sweeping over the pristine storefront. The Plume and Platter was a local success story, a purveyor of gourmet ostrich meats that had ridden the wave of health consciousness sweeping the nation. Its owner, a charismatic and ever-smiling man named Julian Croft, was a local celebrity of sorts. He was the face of the farmers' markets, his picturia beaming man in a crisp white apron, holding a ridiculously large ostrich egg adorned the shop's front window. The initial call had been for a burst water pipe. A plumber, complaining of a foul odor he couldn't trace, had ventured into the shop's large walk-in freezer. What he found had sent him scrambling out into the street, his face the color of spoiled milk, his lunch a cooling puddle on the pavement. The forensic teams were already inside, their white-suited figures moving with a practiced, almost balletic grace through the macabre landscape. The shop itself was immaculate. Gleaming stainless steel counters, knives arranged in a perfect, glittering row, and a refrigerated display case showcasing cuts of deep red ostrich fillet. But behind a heavy, insulated door lay a scene from a fever dream. The freezer was a cavern of frosted horror. Carcasses of frozen ostriches hung from thick metal hooks, their long, featherless necks dangling like grotesque pendulums. But it wasn't the birds that commanded their attention. It was what lay beneath them, what was stacked in the far corners, what was crammed into every available space. Skeletons. Dozens of them. 42, the initial count had confirmed. They were human, that much was immediately obvious. They varied in size, some achingly small. Each one had been meticulously cleaned, the bone bleached to a stark, almost luminous white. They were arranged with a cold, almost artistic precision. Some were curled in fetal positions, others laid out straight, their bony fingers interlaced over their chests. "It's an ossuary," Finch breathed, his voice a mixture of awe and revulsion. "Who does this? Who collects people?" Miles didn't answer. He was crouching, his gloved fingers tracing the edge of a small, near-perfectly preserved skull. A child's. He could see the faint lines where the cranial sutures had not yet fully fused. He felt a familiar, cold knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't just murder. This was something else entirely. This was a collection, a trophy room. The initial sweep of the scene yielded little. Julian Croft's apartment above the shop was as neat and orderly as his business. His finances were in order, his personal life seemingly non-existent. By all accounts, he was a model citizen, a man who sold expensive meat to the city's elite, a man who, it now appeared, had a very dark and very secret hobby. The first 24 hours were a blur of activity. The media had descended like a flock of vultures, their cameras and microphones a constant, invasive presence. The story was a sensation, a lurid, headline-grabbing tale of a real-life house of horrors hidden in plain sight. The Ostrich Farm of Fear, one particularly tasteless tabloid had dubbed it. The forensic analysis of the skeletons began, a slow and painstaking process. Every bone was catalogued, photographed, and examined for any clue, any hint as to who these people were and how they had died. The team, led by Dr. Eris Thorne, a dry-witted forensic anthropologist with a morbid sense of humor and a brilliant mind, worked around the clock. Our collector was a meticulous man, Eris had told Miles during their first briefing, his voice a low rumble. The bones have been professionally cleaned. No tool marks, no signs of amateur butchery. He either had access to a professional maceration unit, or he was a very, very patient man. And cause of death? Miles had asked, his pen hovering over his notebook. Eris had shrugged, a gesture that was both dismissive and deeply unsettling. That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? With no soft tissue, it's almost impossible to say for sure. But I can tell you this, he added, his eyes locking with Miles's, a dark and ancient glint in them. These people did not die peacefully in their sleep. The first break in the case came from a most unexpected source. A local historian, a woman with a passion for the city's forgotten past, contacted the police. She had been researching the history of the building that now housed the Plume and Platter. It had a long and storied past. It had been a tannery, a blacksmith's, and, for a brief and notorious period in the late 19th century, a private anatomical museum. A what? Finch had asked, his skepticism palpable. An anatomical museum, the historian repeated, her voice trembling with excitement. Owned and operated by a rather eccentric and reclusive gentleman named Dr. Alistair Blackwood. He was a surgeon, a man of science, but he was also a man with a rather unusual fascination with the human form. The story she told was a chilling one. Blackwood, it was said, would acquire cadavers for his collection through less than legal means. He was a frequent visitor to the city's gallows, a shadowy figure who would purchase the bodies of the executed for his grisly displays. But there were whispers, rumors that he didn't always wait for his subjects to die of natural or state-sanctioned causes. The museum had been a place of both scientific curiosity and morbid fascination. It was where the city's elite would come to gaze upon the inner workings of the human body, to marvel at the intricate and delicate machinery of life and death. But then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. Blackwood had died under mysterious circumstances, his museum shut down, its contents dispersed. The historian provided them with a faded, sepia-toned photograph of the museum's interior. It showed a large, cavernous room, its walls lined with glass cabinets filled with anatomical curiosities. And in the center of the room, on a raised platform, was a collection of articulated human skeletons. Miles and Finch stared at the photograph, a sense of cold dread creeping up their spines. The arrangement of the skeletons in the photograph was eerily similar to what they had found in Julian Croft's freezer. It was as if Croft had been recreating the museum, piece by gruesome piece. The investigation now had a new and disturbing focus. They weren't just looking for a murderer. They were hunting a man obsessed with the past, a man who was carrying on a legacy of death that had begun over a century ago. As the days turned into a week, the team began to piece together a timeline. The skeletons were of varying ages, some decades old, others much more recent. They were a cross-section of humanity, men, women, and children. The missing persons database was a labyrinth of dead ends and false leads. These were people who had slipped through the cracks, people who had disappeared without a trace. The first victim was identified as a young woman who had gone missing 5 years prior. A runaway, her case had gone cold almost as soon as it was opened. Her dental records were a match. Her skeleton was one of the more recent additions to Croft's collection. The media frenzy reached a fever pitch. The public was both horrified and fascinated. Julian Croft, the man who had sold them their Sunday roasts, was now a monster, a modern-day boogeyman. His face, once a symbol of wholesome, artisanal quality, was now the face of pure, unadulterated evil. But Croft himself was nowhere to be found. He had vanished, leaving behind a shop full of secrets and a city gripped by fear. The manhunt was on, a desperate race against time to find a man who was both a ghost and a monster. Miles found himself consumed by the case. He would spend hours in the freezer, surrounded by the silent, skeletal remains of Croft's victims. He felt a strange, almost personal connection to them. He was their voice, their only hope for justice. He would study the photograph of Dr. Blackwood's museum, trying to understand the mind of a man who could see beauty in death. He read Blackwood's journals, what little of them remained. They were filled with rambling, almost poetic descriptions of human anatomy. Blackwood had seen himself as an artist, his medium the human body. And in the margins of one of the journals, he found a small, almost insignificant note. A reference to a silent partner, a patron who had funded his work. The name was smudged, almost illegible, but Miles could just make out the letters, CROFT. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't just a copycat. This was a legacy, a family business. The Crofts had been in the business of death for generations. The chapter ends with Miles standing in the freezer, the cold seeping into his bones. He looked at the skeletons, at the silent, accusing gazes of their empty eye sockets. He knew that this was just the beginning. The horror of the plume and platter wasn't just about 42 skeletons in a freezer. It was about a darkness that had been festering in the heart of the city for over a century. A darkness that he was now sworn to bring into the light. The hunt for Julian Croft had become a hunt for a ghost who was carrying on a bloody family tradition. And Miles knew that to catch a ghost, he would have to delve deeper into the city's dark and forgotten past. A past that was still very much alive and very, very dangerous. The name Croft echoed in Miles's mind, a discordant chime that refused to be silenced. It was more than a clue. It was a key, an old, rusted thing that promised to unlock a door that had been sealed for over a century. The investigation, which had begun with the grisly discovery in the freezer of the plume and platter, now spiraled back in time, into the gaslit, fog-shrouded streets of the city's Victorian past. Alistair Finch, ever the pragmatist, was skeptical. A dynasty of butchers and bone collectors? Miles. It sounds like something out of a penny dreadful. Life is often stranger than fiction, Alistair, Miles replied, his eyes fixed on the faded photograph of Dr. Blackwood's anatomical museum. And besides, we have nothing else. Julian Croft has vanished. It's as if he's been swallowed by the city. This, he said, tapping the smudged name in Blackwood's journal, is the only thread we have. They began to trace the Croft family tree. It was a long and arduous process, a journey through dusty archives and forgotten records. But what they found was a history as dark and disturbing as the secrets hidden in Julian Croft's freezer. The Crofts had been butchers for generations, their name synonymous with the city's meat trade. But there was another, more clandestine side to their business. They had been what were known in the 19th century as resurrection men, body snatchers who supplied medical schools and private collectors with fresh cadavers. It was a ghoulish trade, but a lucrative one. And their most prominent client, their patron, as Blackwood had called him, had been none other than Dr. Alistair Blackwood. The Croft of that era, a man named Silas Croft, had been more than just a supplier. He had been a partner, a silent partner in Blackwood's gruesome enterprise. He was the one who procured the specimens for the museum, the one who worked in the shadows, his hands stained with the blood of both animals and men. So, Julian Croft is just carrying on the family business, Finch said, a note of reluctant admiration in his voice. It's in his blood, so to speak. It would seem so, Miles replied, a cold dread washing over him. But this is more than just a family tradition, Alistair. This is a sickness, a legacy of death that has been passed down from father to son. The focus of the investigation now shifted. They were no longer just hunting Julian Croft. They were hunting the ghost of Silas Croft, the echo of a man who had been dead for over 100 years, but whose dark influence still lingered. Their search led them to Blackwood Manor, the crumbling Gothic estate on the outskirts of the city where Dr. Alistair Blackwood had lived and died. The house had been abandoned for decades, a place of local legends and ghost stories. It was said that the ghost of Dr. Blackwood still roamed its halls, forever searching for new specimens for his collection. The manor was a place of oppressive silence, a monument to a forgotten and macabre past. The air was thick with the smell of dust and decay, a scent that was eerily reminiscent of the freezer at the Plume and Platter. As they explored the house, they found evidence of Blackwood's gruesome work everywhere. The cellar had been converted into a laboratory, complete with a dissecting table and a human-sized incinerator. And in a hidden room, behind a false wall in the library, they found what they were looking for. Blackwood's secret collection. It was a smaller, more intimate version of his public museum. Glass jars containing preserved organs, anatomical models, and in the center of the room, a single articulated human skeleton. But it was what they found in a locked, leather-bound ledger that sent a chill down Miles's spine. It was Blackwood's private journal, a detailed and disturbing account of his life and work. And in it, he wrote of his partnership with Silas Croft. He described Croft as a kindred spirit, a man who shared his scientific curiosity and his disregard for the sentiments of the common man. He wrote of their nightly excursions to the city's cemeteries, their harvesting of the freshly deceased. But there was a darker side to their partnership. Blackwood wrote of Croft's other acquisitions, of specimens that were not procured from the gallows or the graveyard. He wrote of people who had simply disappeared, of the forgotten and the destitute of the city who had found their final resting place in his jars and on his display stands. And then, in the final entry, dated the day of his death, Blackwood wrote of a falling out with Croft. He had become, he wrote, a liability, a man who knew too much. The last words he wrote were a chilling, desperate plea. "He is coming for me. The butcher wants his final specimen." The official cause of Blackwood's death had been a heart attack. But now they knew the truth. He had been a victim of his own ghoulish trade, another addition to the ever-growing collection of the Croft family. The discovery at Blackwood Manor gave them a new lead. Julian Croft wasn't just recreating the work of his ancestors. He was continuing it. He was a predator, a man who preyed on the city's most vulnerable, the people who would not be missed. The investigation now took on a new urgency. They weren't just looking for a man who collected bones. They were looking for a man who was actively adding to his collection. They began to re-examine the missing persons files, looking for a pattern, a connection between the victims. And slowly, a picture began to emerge. The victims were all transients, runaways, people on the fringes of society. They were the invisible people, the ones the city had forgotten. The forensics team, led by the indefatigable Dr. Eris Thorne, had a breakthrough of their own. They had found microscopic traces of a rare and exotic pollen on the bones of several of the victims. It was a pollen that came from a specific type of acacia tree, a tree that was not native to the region. This discovery sent them down a new and unexpected path. They began to search for any locations in the city where this tree might be found. And their search led them to a surprising and disturbing place, the city's botanical gardens. The gardens were a place of beauty and tranquility, a green oasis in the heart of the bustling city. But as they delved into the garden's history, they uncovered a dark and hidden past. In the 19th century, a section of the gardens had been a potter's field, a burial ground for the city's poor and unclaimed. And in the center of this forgotten cemetery stood a grove of ancient acacia trees, the same trees whose pollen had been found on the bones of Julian Croft's victims. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together. Julian Croft was not just a butcher and a bone collector. He was a grave robber, a ghoul who was plundering the city's forgotten dead to add to his macabre collection. But there was still one piece missing. The more recent victims, the ones who had been identified from the missing persons database, had not been buried in the potter's field. They had been abducted, murdered, and then meticulously cleaned and added to the collection. Julian Croft was not just a grave robber. He was a killer. The investigation now had a dual focus. They were looking for a man who was both a ghost from the past and a very real and present danger. The chapter closes with Miles standing in the forgotten cemetery in the botanical gardens, the ancient acacia trees casting long, skeletal shadows in the fading light. He could feel the weight of the city's history, the echoes of its forgotten dead. He knew that he was getting closer to Julian Croft, closer to the heart of the darkness that had plagued the city for so long. But he also knew that Croft was aware of their pursuit. The ghost was no longer content to remain in the shadows. He was now hunting them. The game had changed. It was no longer a simple investigation. It was a battle of wits, a deadly game of cat and mouse between a detective haunted by the past and a killer who was a product of it. And Miles knew that before this was over, more blood would be shed. The butcher of the Plume and Platter had not yet claimed his final specimen. The city held its breath. The story of the Plume and Platter had become a modern-day fable, a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones. Julian Croft, the smiling butcher, was now a specter, a boogeyman who haunted the collective imagination of the city. The manhunt, which had begun with a sense of grim determination, had now taken on an air of desperation. For Detective Inspector Miles Corrigan, the case had become an obsession. He was a haunted man, haunted by the 42 silent witnesses in the freezer and the ghost of a 19th-century butcher. The line between past and present had blurred, and he found himself walking in the footsteps of a man who had been dead for over a century. The discovery in the botanical gardens had been a turning point. It had given them a geographical and psychological profile of their killer. Julian Croft was a man with a deep connection to the city's history, a man who saw himself as a curator of its forgotten dead. But the more recent victims, the ones who had been abducted and murdered, were a deviation from the pattern. They were a sign that Croft's obsession was evolving, that he was no longer content to simply plunder the graves of the past. He was now creating his own history, his own collection of the dead. The investigation had reached a stalemate. They had a name, a history, a motive of sorts, but the man himself remained elusive. He was a ghost in the machine of the city, a man who knew how to disappear. The breakthrough, when it came, was not from a piece of forensic evidence or a lucky tip. It came from a moment of quiet reflection, a flash of intuition in the mind of Miles Corrigan. He was sitting in his office late one night, surrounded by the files and photographs of the case. His eyes were drawn to the photograph of Dr. Blackwood's anatomical museum. He had looked at the photograph 100 times, but now he saw something he had missed before. It was a detail in the background, a small, almost insignificant item on a shelf. It was a taxidermied ostrich, its long neck curved in an elegant, almost lifelike pose. The ostrich. It had been there all along, the silent, feathered symbol of the entire grotesque affair. The Plume and Platter, the ostrich meat. It was all connected. But how? The question gnawed at him. He began to research the history of ostriches in the city. And what he found was a strange and forgotten chapter in the city's past. In the late 19th century, there had been a brief and ill-fated craze for ostrich farming. A local aristocrat, a man with more money than sense, had imported a flock of the exotic birds, hoping to create a new and lucrative industry. The farm was located on the outskirts of the city, on a large and isolated piece of land. The venture had failed, the birds had died, and the farm had been abandoned. The land was eventually sold and developed, but the original farmhouse, a crumbling and forgotten relic of a bygone era, still stood. And the name of the family who had owned the farm, the family who had sold the land to the developer, was Croft. It was the final piece of the puzzle. The farm was the key. It was where the two threads of the Croft family's dark history, their trade in human remains and their fascination with the exotic, converged. Miles and Finch descended on the old ostrich farm like a storm. The farmhouse was a skeletal, crumbling structure, its windows like empty eye sockets staring out over the overgrown fields. The air was thick with the smell of decay, a smell that was now nauseatingly familiar. And in the cellar of the farmhouse they found him. Julian Croft was not the monster they had imagined. He was a small, unassuming man, his face pale and drawn. He was surrounded by the tools of his trade, not the knives and cleavers of a butcher, but the delicate instruments of a taxidermist. The cellar was a workshop of horrors. Half-finished projects lay on tables, the skins of animals stretched and treated, their glass eyes staring with a lifeless, uncanny realism. And in the center of the room, on a large metal table, was his latest project. It was the body of a young woman, one of the recent missing persons. Her body was pale and bloodless, her eyes wide and staring. She was in the process of being preserved, her skin treated with chemicals, her organs removed and replaced with a wire frame. Croft offered no resistance. It was as if he had been waiting for them. He confessed to everything, his voice a flat, emotionless monotone. He told them of his family's history, of the legacy that had been passed down to him. He did not see himself as a murderer, but as an artist, a preserver of beauty. He believed that he was saving these people from the anonymity of death, that he was giving them a form of immortality. The skeletons in the freezer were his masterpieces, his collection of the city's forgotten souls. He had learned the art of preserving bodies from his father, who had learned it from his father before him. It was a family tradition, a dark and secret craft that had been honed over generations. The older skeletons, the ones from the potter's field, had been his practice pieces, his way of perfecting his art. But he had grown tired of working with the dead. He wanted to work with fresh material, to capture the spark of life before it faded. He had started abducting people, choosing his victims from the fringes of the city, people who he believed would not be missed. He would watch them, learn their routines, and then, when the time was right, he would take them. He would kill them quickly and painlessly, he claimed, a single, precise injection of a powerful sedative. And then he would bring them here, to his workshop, to begin the long and meticulous process of preservation. He was a monster, but a monster of a different kind than they had imagined. He was not driven by rage or malice, but by a twisted, artistic obsession. He was a man who had blurred the lines between life and death, between beauty and horror. The trial of Julian Croft was a media sensation. The city was both repulsed and fascinated by the story of the butcher who was also a taxidermist, the man who had turned murder into an art form. He was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison, his name now forever etched in the city's annals of infamy. But for Miles Corrigan, the case was never truly over. The ghosts of the 42 skeletons still haunted him. He had found their killer, but he could not give them back their names, their stories. They remained the silent, anonymous victims of one family's dark legacy. The final scene of the story finds Miles standing once again in the freezer of the Plume and Platter, now a grim place of pilgrimage for the city's morbidly curious. The skeletons had been removed, but their absence was a tangible presence, a cold and empty void. He looked at the empty hooks where the ostrich carcasses had once hung, at the gleaming stainless steel counters that had been the stage for a madman's art. And he knew that the story of Julian Croft and his 42 skeletons would be a part of him forever. It was a story of the darkness that can hide behind the most ordinary of surfaces, of the secrets that can be hidden behind a smiling face. It was a story of a city's forgotten past and the ghosts that still walk its streets. And it was a story that served as a chilling reminder that sometimes the most monstrous horrors are not the ones we see in our nightmares, but the ones that are hidden in plain sight, waiting to be discovered behind the closed doors of a place as ordinary as an ostrich meat shop. The bell above the door chimed as he left, a final, mocking farewell from the abattoir of whispers.